Hi, I'm Mark, and welcome to tonight's presentation from Project Management Institute of Puget Sound. It's when projects go wrong. Before we get to the presentation, we want to go through a few chapter announcements. The first is on October 24th and 31st. We have a hybrid online PMP exam preparation going on. It'll be a virtual event. Check that out at www.pugetsoundpmi.org. We have the next PMO roundtable on October 26th. So you can see there, the topic is, what is your PMO strategy? Are you in sync and relative to your customers? How do you know? That'll be on October 26th again from 5:30 to 7. You get 1.5 PDUs and it's virtual again and it's free, but please RSVP. We have a CAPM certification preparation works on October 26th, 27th, and 28th from 5 to 9. It also is virtual, and there are member and student rates that apply. This is a valuable entry-level course for people being interested in project management and getting their entry-level certification. We have another presentation on November 5th from 3 to 9. This is of servant leadership that gets, and I won't say that word, done. Projects and agile processes fail when people fail to lead. This workshop is about putting the how-to techniques used at 120 VC in your hands. And there's an early bird rate before October 23rd. There's another PMO roundtable on November 23rd from 5:30 to 7. You get 1.5 PDUs. It's a virtual event. It's free. The topic is, what is the best practices for PMO facilitated portfolio management? And now I'm going to bring us on to our presentation with Nate and Dean. This is our first in our series of when projects fail. I'll go ahead and let Nate and Dean present themselves. They come from both from a long background of project management. And I'm going to stop sharing and Nate and Dean are going to start.
All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for spending your evening with us. So Dean and I are excited to be here. The first iteration of when projects go wrong. So I hope that's not not foreshadowing how this goes, but hold on. Here we go. All right, so today we are going to talk about healthcare.gov. Okay, it's a pretty well-known project, and yeah, we're gonna run through some stuff, and hopefully you get some good takeaways out of it. So a little background about myself and Dean. I spent 12 years in the Air Force as a C-17 pilot, active duty. And then transitioned into the reserves about 6 years ago. So C-17's a large cargo plane, and that plane essentially would take a crew and fly around the world. So a little bit different background than most. When I got out, I got into IT project management and the Scrum Master Agile world, and started a company called Form 100 Consulting. We take other former military officers with experience like myself, and we build high-performing software teams for clients. Okay. We do that through Agile coaching, technical project management work, and program management. So Dean, if you want to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, Dean Smith, Nate hit it. Similar background as Nate. In fact, we flew together down at Joint Base Lewis McChord. That's how we got to know each other. When I got out, I went to UW for grad school, and then as I was graduating, Nate said there might be an opportunity for me, and it sounded great. Jumped on it. I've been primarily working at Boeing right now, and applying a lot of the project management skills and lessons from getting my PMP and things like that. So that's me.
Yeah, so Dean was literally my co-pilot, right? I probably took that picture. I'm not sure if I did or not. I don't know. You look happier than when I remember flying with you. So here's how today's talk's going to be structured. We're gonna give a little overview and intro. We're gonna talk through the timeline of what happened, and then go through some of the things that were identified in a lot of open source case studies. We're gonna do some interaction from the group, so we want to hear your thoughts and get some feedback from everyone else that's joining us today. And then we'll talk about the turnaround and how things how they turn the ship around and fix things to make it a workable project. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. All right. So I want to start off though with a huge disclaimer. One is that Dean and I weren't there. Okay. We weren't in this project. There's potentially people in the audience that wouldn't be out of the realm. We went to the open source resources to find information on this. And we used a lot of our actual military experience and working in the government, and also our experience working on large IT projects, large bureaucratic projects, to pull out some of the key lessons. And we'll share those with you. Okay. And another disclaimer, which I think is almost humorous, because when Mike and I were talking about this, it was 8 months ago, and we were planning to do this a lot earlier. And because of COVID, things just slid to the right, and I didn't really plan to pick the most political topic at the most political time. So that wasn't by design. And so this won't be a political debate between me and Dean. Okay, I heard there's one going on, but that's not what this is going to be. This is going to be a non-political conversation. Yeah, so we don't have any stance here on if it's a good thing or a bad thing, or anything like that. Really what we're focused on is, they had a goal and the project execution of how we ended up where we ended up in healthcare's initial rollout. Okay, so those two huge disclaimers. Let's go ahead and get started. Before we jump in, I want to talk a little bit about why we study failure. And Dean and I, having the military aviation background, we both are interested in this topic. And we're doing that because as a pilot, I've heard about all of the aircraft issues that happen in my community. And aircraft mishaps go through a really rigorous flight safety investigation. And there's a lot of lessons learned from those investigations. And I'll say for sure that I'm a better and safer pilot because I hear about what other people did wrong. If you look at these two instances, both Dean and I know exactly what happened and how to not do that again. Okay, so if you can see the C-17 there on the runway, doesn't have its gear down, which is typically recommended when you're landing. And then the other plane's a C-5 that crashed, and it was an issue with an engine malfunction, but there was mistakes made. So these types of lessons are things that personally I'm passionate about, because if we can learn from other projects failures, we can identify the problems earlier, right? And we can be more heightened to when things start to go wrong. We'll have some experience through learning others that we wouldn't have otherwise, because you don't want to make all those mistakes yourself. Okay, so we are going to show a video real quick, and just to give everyone a reminder of the healthcare.gov all right, so I think it's safe to say that if your project ends up as a cold open on Saturday Night Live, something might have went wrong. Okay, that is kind of probably a good rule of thumb. All right, but there were definitely some issues, and it unfortunately was a very high profile failure. So now we got a little background here. We're going to jump into giving some context and a little bit of the timeline.
Okay, hey everyone. Looking to give you the timeline, kind of play by play of what happened. to give us context to the lessons learned. Being that this was a government project, it's rife with acronyms. Please don't get too terribly hung up on them. I will do my best to refrain from using them, but given my military background, it's going to be difficult for me. So I want to give you guys a little bit of exposure now, and then hopefully we won't get too lost. The first one there, the PPACA/ACA. So that's the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. I think the common nomenclature is Obamacare. Again, with our apolitical stance, we don't want to use that. And from the case and most of the stuff we pull on, you'll see ACA or PPACA. HHS, that's the Department of Health and Human Services, which healthcare.gov, our responsibility fell under. We're going to be talking about the Office of Consumer Information and Insurance Oversight. And then that became the Center for Consumer Information and Insurance Oversight. Not too terribly important. Just when we talk about and you see that difference, know that wasn't a typo, and it became a different office, and we'll get into that. The other big acronym is CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. It's not CMMS, just CMS. And then FFM is the Federally Facilitated Marketplace. That kind of became like the common name for the website and everything under the website to make it function, the FFM. Next. So the timeline we're going to be covering is March 2010 to the launch October 2013. So March 2010, that was the big political kickoff of healthcare.gov, and that was when the Affordable Care Act was signed. And the background of the Affordable Care Act, it was intended to expand access to for health insurance coverage, and it did this through insurance reforms, requiring business to offer health insurance coverage, and then also requiring individuals to obtain coverage. That's the mandate. And then the part that we're going to be concentrating on from the Affordable Care Act is the establishing of the health insurance exchange. And then the requirement of the act was that each state would be operational before January 1st, 2014. Next one. So the initial office that was created to enact all the provisions of the Affordable Care Act was in April 2010 was the Office of Consumer Information and Insurance Oversight. And this was a separate office that was created under the Health and Human Service Secretary. So it was a separate office that reported directly to the secretary. And it was a very small, capable group, and it had a very startup-like feel to the organization when they kicked off. And they had early wins with development and releasing. So the first release was the 1st of July in 2010. They put out the Pathfinder website. So it was an early iteration, but very basic one that people could browse and look at plan options. Next in the timeline is September 2010. And this is kind of when the initial architecture was developed for healthcare.gov. And then if you look at the diagram on the left, don't get too terribly concerned. I just wanted to point out how kind of complex it was. So healthcare.gov consisted of kind of 3 main functions. It was the enterprise identity management system, which controlled the identity and access. So that's when you logged onto the website, you went through the EIDM, and then so that had to be built, and that was going to support multiple CMS systems. So they're going to build the system and then incorporate into other CMS systems. Then there was the FFM, which was kind of the core of the marketplace and had 3 main subcomponents, which is the federally facilitated marketplace checked your eligibility and enrollment. It managed the plans and give you plan options. And then there was the financial management aspect of it that integrated with the insurance agencies and allowed customers to actually purchase plans. Feeding into the FFM was the data service hub, the hub. Now it routed the federal and state marketplaces with the Medicare and Child Health Insurance Program agencies and other federal agencies that it cross-referenced. So this included the IRS, the Social Security Administration, and things like the Department of Defense TRICARE. So pretty complex, and I just bring this all up because we noticed in September it is evident pretty early that it was a pretty complex system that required a lot of coordination, and there were going to be a lot of dependencies. So that's that. The next major event was in January of 2011. So after 10 months, the Health and Human Services determined that the Office of Consumer, the OCIIO, was ill-equipped to handle such a large and complex project. So the OCIIO became the Center for Consumer Information and Insurance Oversight. So that's that acronym switch. And it moved under the CMS. So it no longer was an office reporting directly to the secretary, but became an entity within the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Service. Now, this is done because CMS was a major portion of Health and Human Services, and it had a lot of expertise and existing technology that leaders thought they could leverage to ease the development of healthcare.gov. So they wanted to use that existing expertise and enterprise rather than build from scratch. Unfortunately, when they did that, the staff originally from the OCIO was dispersed throughout the various CMS divisions, and a lot of the FFM responsibilities they were also divvied up into the various CMS divisions. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an acronym soup, and just to highlight what different offices were doing stuff. So the Office of Acquisition and Grants Management, the OAGM, they were responsible for the FFM contracts. Then the OFM, the Office of Financial Management, was responsible for budget. The OC, the Office of Communication, was responsible for all the interactions with customers. And then the CMCS, the Center for Medicaid and CHIP Services, was responsible for the application form for assistance. So again, the move of the OCIO under CMS dispersed things at an organizational chart level, but it also spread the group geographically. So the new office, the CCIIO, was based out of Bethesda in Maryland. The CMS headquarters was based out of Baltimore, and then the Office of Information Services, which did a lot of the IT support for Health and Human Services, that was based out of DC. And if you're not too familiar with DC traffic, it's worse than Seattle traffic. I guess that's the best thing. And to understand the hesitance to travel from Baltimore to DC, I would equate it to trying to go from Seattle down to Olympia on a Friday of a 3-day weekend. It's not something you're gonna want to do, which yeah, little context. Next area I want to hit on, it's from July of 2011 to January 2012 was the kind of main procurement period for healthcare.gov. So in the procurement process, CMS used indefinite delivery and indefinite quantity contracts, an IDIQ contract. And what this was, it used existing contracts with pre-qualified companies that could be expanded to include the new scope of work. Now, the benefit of using an IDIQ contract is a much more streamlined and faster process. So you had pre-existing contracts, you had pre-qualified companies, and you could just go to them. The downside of it is you had much fewer options and much less technologies you could incorporate. So specifically for the FFM, there were only 16 companies that could have competed for the contract. And when the request for a proposal went out, they only went to 16, and then the only 4 contractors actually submitted proposals. So it was very limited options that the CMS could even pull from. So the result was CGI Federal was awarded the FFM build, and then QSSI was awarded the Data Hub and the Enterprise Identity Management service. These were awarded in September. However, the process kept going until January because there was a bid protest for the hub. So it required modifying and revising the task order. To also note with the contracts, since we're talking about it, the contracts used were cost plus fixed fee. So it was, according to the reports, it was typical of tasks with so much uncertainty at the beginning, so they couldn't define all the requirements when doing the procurement. So there needed to be some open-endedness. So contracts are cost plus fixed fee. Okay. Next timeline item is December 2012 and February 2013, which is getting toward our 1 October kind of release date when the open enrollment period is supposed to begin. Now these were the dates that the states are supposed to identify if they were going to use the FFM, the federally facilitated marketplace, or they were going to develop their own marketplace for insurance coverage. Some of the verbiage from some of the case studies indicate that the several state officials criticized CMS for being slow to provide regulations and guidance for developing state marketplaces. So it just kind of highlights how late in the process they were finalizing requirements, to be honest, because part of it was incorporating all the state requests for assistance in the marketplace. In the end, there were 36 states, including 7 state partnerships, that opted in to use the federal marketplace, and 15 states established their own marketplace. Okay. Primary purpose of this slide is to show the moving milestones that ended up happening. So you can see with the FFM, there was the initial period of trying to incorporate 6 months before launch to do the operational readiness review, and then have the review and to do the fixes. In the end, that got compressed where the readiness review was essentially done right before the release. So within days of the actual release. Okay. And then we're getting into the kind of the final countdown portion. So this was starting in July 30th when things were getting real. We were really approaching the launch date. Now, prior to this date, from June to October of 2012, CMS had actually hired technical advisors who were providing reports that continuously laid out problems in the whole development and build process. So that was some information. And then throughout 2012 and 2013, the firm Turning Point Global Solutions was hired, and they provided 11 technical reports that gave scathing reviews of the progress of the project as well. And then in early 2013, the HHS secretary actually hired McKinsey to do a review and come up with some recommendations. And they also had negative comments on the progress of the project. So in all, there was 18 documented warnings that you might be behind schedule. But we didn't really see any actions taken by CMS until 30 July, which was the account light launch fail. So Account Lite was the pre-enrollment account creation system that was pretty minimal functionality. It should have been low-hanging fruit, for all the developers to be able to hit that milestone, and they didn't hit it. So in the late July, additional CMS staff were assigned, and we saw a 117% increase of CMS staff added to the project in an effort to kind of get the project over the finish line. And in the 20th August, CGI had a demo in which they failed the live demo. So they tried to do a demo with just still shots, everyone's favorite demo of, if this was working, you would see something beautiful and amazing, but please look at these pictures and take our word. So that happened on 20 August, and that created this situation where everyone was finally acknowledging that they were really behind schedule. And it wasn't until August where a serious look at project scope was looked at, and they started to try to reduce scope at that later time. In addition, so while they're trying to reduce scope, we had other events such as 24 September, the CIO was doing his review for an authorization to operate, and noted that there was no security testing. So they got a interim authorization to operate signed by an administrator, and security testing wasn't actually completed until December of 2013. And then on the 26th, within 72 hours of the launch, CMS realized that they didn't have the capacity. So there was a request to double the capacity of their website 72 hours before launch. And then the days before the launch, the enterprise identity management system was suffering outages. So a lot of events leading right up to the launch. And then we finally get the launch on 1 October, and they were able to launch a website. Unfortunately, they had 250,000 concurrent users try to access healthcare.gov on the 1 October. And of those, they had 6 successful applications. So as Nate said at the beginning, I think a new metric was created for project success, and that's don't end up on Saturday Night Live.
All right, thanks. So it's a lot of information, a lot of things in a progression. It was a really large project, and I think that that's important, to think about. And so let's go through some of the lessons learned. Some of the things that, Dean and I, when we went through all this material, pulled out, a lot of it's from the OIG report from Department of Health and Human Services. Okay, so, the first thing that jumps out is just the delay in requirements. And granted, this is a super political thing. Like, there were legal challenges to the law. There were changes. There was a lot of political posturing. And that just caused delays. Like, they're being asked to build out something as requirements are constantly changing, right? So it's, it's hitting a moving target. And the states were playing politics with some of this as well. So so they had to make these connections and make sure that they complied with all these different agencies, and they weren't sure where these agencies were landing. So they would make assumptions on certain paths, and then find out later that wasn't a right assumption, and it would change. And so they spent a lot of time doing rework, essentially, right? And so that's going to cause delays. Reworks worse than doing it right the first time in some respects. So yeah, I mean, really, it was just requirements and scope weren't delayed or weren't locked down in a timely manner.
Okay. Another major finding was the poor transition to CMS. So, we kind of hinted at it when we went over it on the timeline, but the 10 months into the project, going from that startup culture of the OCIIO to CMS, which is very bureaucratic, had some costs, and the personnel changes and the reconfiguring roles and your timelines. And then by the time you complete the change, the project was already beginning work behind the schedule. So that was a major contributing factor. And then it was trying to weigh the benefits of moving to a large bureaucratic structure, which is, yes, there are more resources available, but when you're separating all your staff, and you're separating people geographically, and you're introducing all those bureaucratic processes, that's one of the trade-offs you have to contend with. And then with that, it's also the ineffective collaboration. So even within CMS, the collaboration department to department, having to go through all the structures and processes each department had. And then also the way it was set up with contractors and FTE within CMS, that collaboration effort, and while existing, and then geographic separation, which maybe not so much of a concern now as we're getting a little more accustomed to that, but at that time for that project, geographic separation wasn't a major issue. One of the quotes from a CCIIO official in a report was, "We were never fully accepted by the CMS as a whole."
Yeah, and like I equate this to like a startup getting bought by a huge company and then just getting like broken up, right? That culture of that small group that had that initial win kind of got squashed, I think, when they rolled over to this big bureaucratic org. Yeah, and being in the military as an officer, Dean and I think both agree that eventually everything comes down to leadership. And there are clearly leadership issues here. So I think the moving around of orgs, coupled with the fact that they didn't know who was in charge. When they spread out, they didn't have one voice. They had competing organizations trying to potentially, play political games with, internal office politics type stuff. So decisions weren't made quickly. And then, and it wasn't always just the leadership's fault either. Because of that kind of dysfunction, there wasn't really clear and concise information being given to the leadership level. Right. And so, some of the things that jumped out in the report for me were, when asked, so here's a quote. So when asked who led the federal marketplace project, several staff named positions that were unfilled. So they just named the office and there wasn't anybody there. And then they said, well, what division leads a project? And they said 4 divisions, which automatically jumped to office space for me. Okay. So, and so you end up getting lack of decisions. And in the flying world, like, it's better to make bad decisions than no decisions. And so you're just stuck in a state of paralysis.
Okay. Another major finding was the mismanagement of the key website contract. So really from the reading, just the contract process was set up to fail. Part of that was the over-reliance on that IDIQ contract, the indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contract, which, having dealt with a little bit of this procurement process, like when you have like a little kind of a cheat code, maybe you lean on that a little too much. The finding was that 92% of the contracts for the FFM were awarded to under previously established contracts. So they weren't going out, they weren't finding the best and brightest, they weren't finding the new technology that fit the moment and the need, but they were overly reliant on what was easiest. And in doing so, they limited the number of bids they could get and the new capabilities those bids could have brought in. And then the political uncertainty, also kind of set up that procurement management process for failure. There was uncertainty about funding with the political actions, and then interacting with so many other agencies in the states, there's unclear technical specifications. So that would definitely hinder that procurement process. The other major thing to talk about is the cost plus fixed fee contract. The thing is that contract does make sense when requirements are fully defined, as it was in this case, but it just, a lot of risk then is not assumed by um, the contractor, but the government in this case, and is not necessarily bad, but given that you understand that risk, you need to then understand that greater oversight and management is required for that. Understanding based on this contract model, your incentives for the contractor aren't to reduce costs or necessarily maintain timeline, because the way that it's laid out, they're going to get paid. Another major factor, when you're dealing with contract and you have that separation of contractor versus the FTEs, is there wasn't that coordination. So technology choices were made without the contractor. So when they're considering technology choices, like, do we develop in SQL or use MarkLogic, which was a NoSQL technology platform, CGI Federal gave input that their strength was in SQL. They didn't necessarily have a lot of experience in the NoSQL technology platform, and their preference was SQL. However, CMS went ahead and selected MarkLogic, and then simply notified CGI Federal via technical direction letter in 2012. So it was a little late for even CGI to maybe get that expertise and be able to make the changes necessary to roll with that. The other issue with the contract was contract performance, and then mismanagement of that. So on 2 different occasions in April and November, there was documented written concerns to CGI Federal regarding their performance. But aside from that, very little action. In August, when they did try to take some action by withholding fees, their contract actually didn't allow them to really withhold fees. So CMS tried, and they were able to withhold $267,000, which ended up being only about 2% of the $12 million in fees paid to CGI Federal. So even the stick that they had, they couldn't wield it very well.
Yeah, and all of that really got us to the point when we're getting close to launch, right? And so all of a sudden we realized that it's time to panic. Okay, so that all of a sudden realized, like, that we only have 9 months to complete this stuff. Some quotes that you heard that came out of the report where, they said, like, October 2013 seemed a long way off, right? So how many here have had that issue come up where, it's like a year away, we're fine. But then eventually you get to a point where everyone goes, we're not fine. So, I mean, they only had a few months to complete these really critical tasks. And, security, functionality, they realized that there's a lot of stuff to do, and they left themselves in a really compressed timeline. And in addition, the government wasn't really used to Agile, and they were using Agile in this project. And so that meant to a lot of the policymakers and the leadership that scope could change easily. And so they were making changes, up in 2 months, up into way too close to the launch date.
So again, another finding was the resistance to bad news. So we talked about the 18 documented concerns from outside agencies and people hired to kind of assess the progress of the project. And maybe after the 10th, they just stopped caring. What's the 11th bad news? So there's the appearance that they became desensitized to bad news. The other way they got desensitized was with such a large project, they found that the reporting was a lot of activity and not necessarily progress. And that kind of gets back to one of the first things, the lack of leadership. So there was lack of overall picture on how we were doing, but it was a major project and everyone was hard at work. And so we created kind of watermelon status, right? Like, oh man, these guys are doing so much work. We're green, but if you looked underneath that green status, it was kind of red underneath. So that's the reporting activity versus actual progress.
Yeah, and when they got to, when you get all that news, you got to do something about it. And I think, the large bureaucratic nature of the CMS, basically they just stayed the course. And I think that's what they were built to do. The organization had rolled out large programs, Medicare and Medicaid. They were used to that type of project, and this website and marketplace was much more dynamic with much more complicated technology. So they just kept on marching.
They kept marching, and then we showed it in that timeline toward the end where it became obvious that things weren't going right. And they tried to make some corrections, but those corrections were weak and they were too late to really make the difference. So we talked about the 117% increase in personnel, and then just it's always good to think of Brooks Law, which is adding more developers later in project will actually slow the project down. And then they try to do leadership. They actually placed the CMS COO to the head of the project, but even that, he must have been an ineffective leader because the findings were that not everyone on the project knew he was the new head of the project at time of launch. So that was an ineffective change. And then the idea of cutting scope to make a deadline is a good idea, but when you're months behind schedule, it's not effective to cut that scope a few weeks before the launch date. So yeah, and then when you're cutting scope, they kept actually increasing the requirements with computing power and those kind of things.
Yeah, and it was just not enough, right? And then you ended up with project failure. Okay. And so what we're going to do here is pause, right? So really, we've gone through the timeline, and how it started to where they ended up, and then pulled a bunch of lessons learned, out of the reports and out of the documentation. So this is the point where we want to get your input on what you think actually was the biggest issue that we went through. Okay, so I'm going to ask Mike to kick off a Zoom poll. All right, and there's really going to be two questions. One is, what do you think was the biggest issue? And then we'll do another one, I think, which is what would you do to fix it? Okay, and so they're multiple choice, so you might have other things, but pick the one you like the most out of the list. All right, Mike, and then whenever you get enough, a good amount, it'd be interesting to share the results with the group. So we're gonna need that elevator music. All right. So hopefully everyone can see that. Interesting. All right, so the winner was leadership issues. Awesome. Number 2, delays in requirements and scope. And then lack of corrective action, and then org change. But interesting that people didn't think it was reporting compressed technical timeline or procurement issues. Cool. Mike, did you want to do the other one, or did you just want to stick with one?
I can do the other one. Give me just a sec.
You got it, man. The beauty of remote webinars.
Hey, Nate, while Mike is doing that, I'd like to remind everyone to please post your questions in the Q&A. So Nate and Dean, can answer them at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
I think this is great. We can crowdsource all the PMPs in the room.
I'm going to close the poll in 10 seconds with 79% in.
All right.
Nope, correct chat, 83%.
Who's the holdouts?
And here you are.
All right. Oh man, risk identification and mitigation. I think that's surprising to me. I would have done the. Well, I did actually. I did the focus on quality. That was the only one. So, awesome. All right. So let's take a few minutes. We'll kind of breeze through this a little bit just to see what they actually did, and then we'll go into Q&A.
Okay. So this portion about fixing the glitch, this is kind of after the 1 October launch date, and then still within the first open enrollment period. Kind of what the team did to try to fix the problem as best they could. So the first thing was just pivoted to a new strategy. So kind of reminds me of I know some people dread them, but I love retrospectives after something goes wrong, because it's so easy to generate the conversation, because everyone knows it's like, yeah, we need to do something about this. So the new strategy was focusing on fixing the website. Most importantly, the resources they brought on were additional technical experts, but also like a leader. So they brought on Jeffrey Zients, who was a former Bain executive, and then he had a reputation within the federal government as Mr. Fix-It, as he was brought on to fix the Cash for Clunkers website rollout as well. So there's the sense of urgency and the new strategy just to focus on delivery and fixing the website itself. Adoption of the badgeless culture was another thing instituted by the new team and new leadership. So there's the removal of titles, removal of all the divisional and organizational kind of roadblocks and things, and becoming that one team focused on fixing the problems, where anyone could raise issues and that person would get attention like anyone else. So integration of functions, and that was recognizing they need to fight through the bureaucracy of CMS and all the different departments there. And so trying to make the team working on the all hands on deck for healthcare.gov making them cross-functional. So one team can kind of do everything and not have to do their part and then pass it on. So we can get things done in that process. And then the next bit was planning for problems. So doing more for risk identification, mitigation, and then building in more time for testing and problem fixing. The results of all this, by late November, so still within the open enrollment period, they were up 90% of the time versus early November, just the 42% of the time.
Yeah, and finally, what they do after that for the next launch. Okay, so they maybe hobbled through the first one, wounded, crawling across the finish line maybe, and for the next launch, they kind of redid it the right way, I think. So they brought in Accenture, okay, that's pretty well known, and they focused on some big pieces, which is really like ruthless prioritization is what they said. And when you think about that, like they weren't gold plating anything anymore. They had really tight, what should we build culture. And then they locked down those changes. So they didn't really let additional scope come in like they had before. A huge focus on quality and making sure that what they built worked. Okay, and so in a software development environment, quality first is super important and makes everything else go fast. Okay, so if you hear people saying going slow is going fast, that's what they mean. All right, they simplified the process, they streamlined things, and they built a culture of continuous learning and open communication. And so we talked about like the badgeless culture and and really breaking down silos. And essentially it worked, right? So the first day of enrollment for the first rollout, they got 6 people through. Okay, and then the second rollout, the first day they got 60,000. So so they did well. All right. And so everything worked out for healthcare.gov in the end. So we like to give happy ending webinars here, and that's what we do. Happy ending as I show airplane crashes. Okay. But look, just to wrap all this up, all right. I wish we were in person. It would be a little more interactive. But look, the warning signs were there, and the things that we hope you take away are that maybe this lets you ID some issues in your current project, and not to ignore those warning signs and to take corrective action early. All right, and what I found when I went through this and read through this is that this is not a unique thing. Like I've been on very, very large software projects in regulated environments, and you see a lot of these same trends. And so having seen and gone through them and gone through this report, like you really start to identify them faster, and that allows you to fix them faster. So, that's really the key when I'm flying military aircraft, and I think back to other crashes and accident investigations I heard, are those things that I just identify going down a path faster and breaking the chain of events before you get to, a cold open on Saturday Night Live. Okay, so the final thing we'll say is just continue to learn from others. I'm really happy that Mike got me going on this event. I like this idea, and just talking about when things didn't go well and what we can learn from it. So that's it. That's all we got. But we're open and excited to take your questions. So Mike, or whoever's emceeing, over to you.
Marco, Mauricio, we have any questions?
Yeah, so we have 3 questions so far. And to all the attendees, you still have some time to type a question if you wish. So the first question is, did you see the risk analysis for the project?
In the documentation, I guess I saw the case studies. I saw they didn't have any of the any of the forms or any of the artifacts I saw for that. The comments on it said that was one of the failures was poor risk identification and poor risk management for the overall project.
Yeah, and I think that the siloed aspect of this really, when you talk about the failure of reporting and the failure of the different organizations that are kind of working on different things but not talking to each other, I don't think they maybe had risk analysis internal to each one of their streams, but my guess is that they didn't have one, across the project. And it goes down to not having a single, not that lack of leadership, which everyone identified as the biggest issue, because that's something that, anyone that's leading a big project like this is going to want to be all over the risk.
Thank you, Nate. Another question is, did they list any of the risk they found post-mortem?
Did they list any of their what?
Well, any of the risk that they found post-mortem?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I asked this question. I actually asked both questions together. And I think you already answered it because they didn't have any risk analysis, and that was the problem, right? So all these things that happened afterward, a lot of them you could have thought up at the beginning of a project, right? Some of these really made sense. And maybe that's also, I'm just kind of brainstorming here and probably just talking too much, but maybe this is also because it was a political thing. Like maybe they couldn't do risk analysis because they wanted to make everybody happy, if that makes sense. Like they didn't want people to know what could go wrong.
Yeah, and I think to that point, it takes a lot of leadership to admit that your project is not in the green, right? It takes you put yourself out there when you say that your project, and especially if it's a really high visibility project, that you need help, right? And that's a hard thing. That's a hard thing, I think, for a lot of organizations to do and a lot of projects to do, because you want to report that you're a really good project manager and everything's going well. And so, that at a large scale in a hyper political and hyper visible thing, probably was causal. Mm-hmm. And I think I'll say to that, Marcus brought up a great point, which is kind of the post-mortem look. Like it's easy for us to read through a report and say, this is all the things that went wrong and this is what you should do to fix it. But having gone and walked and listened to a lot of from a pilot analogy, having listened to a lot of aircraft mishaps, I don't do that anymore because I find that I get really close to doing something that they did, and I can easily see how it would happen, right? So I guess maybe just to say that I don't think if I was leading this project, I would have done better or not, right? That's not the point of this. The point is to just highlight those so maybe we can make it better in the future.
Mauricio, did you want to read the other questions? There were a few other questions, or do you want me to read them?
Yes, I can read them. They just came up. So I have a quick question. This one is easy to answer. Nate, are you going to share the slides after the presentation?
Yeah, sure.
Right, thank you. So I'm going to select one of the other questions here. What percentage increase in staff was added after the failed launch? Failed launch.
Yeah, no, great point.
I didn't see anything specific to the numbers. And there was the kind of all hands on deck, and there was a bringing in of more savvy technical expertise, external technical expertise. But in terms of specific numbers, I didn't see anything for that.
Yeah, not after the failed release. And, I'm sure it's in the reports that we can dig up. But as far, they basically doubled the staff in the last, in the last 3 or 4 months, which is which again, goes back to Brooks' law, I think. But I don't know the end size. It's a good question.
So I see a couple of similar questions here about Agile. So did they continue to try to use an Agile approach, or did they adopt more of a waterfall approach for the second round deployment, where requirements were more tightly managed?
That,
Take that, Dean.
well, one of the great ironies was one of the findings was they actually tried to adopt an agile approach at the onset of the project, which I think there could be another case study written on like fake agile and the agile failure of this project. Because if you saw those timelines where there was, very marked like readiness reviews and that, that waterfall type like progression, but they just try to do it in an iterative manner. And we saw like the fake agile that really just allowed, requirements to just constantly change, so yeah, I think it was an attempted and agile approach at the onset, but it was poorly executed agile. I think they did continue to use like an agile approach in the turnaround as well, but bringing on a little more agile expertise, and it was more appropriately executed agile to include that quality over making deadlines, where they would, if they weren't ready or requirements changed, they would change things as they went along.
Yeah, and I would just piggyback on that and say that it's I wouldn't look at this as agile caused it to fail, or waterfall caused it to fail, or if they did this, it would have mattered almost, because it really would have came down to the execution, and from the agile work that I do and what I've seen, going agile doesn't make you faster in itself, right? It's how you execute and how you build your team and do certain things that sometimes you see organizations hide behind agile to say to not want to give you status or progress, and so navigating that is a challenge, I think, both in waterfall and in agile.
Okay, thank you. So here's another one. Do you think this will happen again if the project happened in 2020 minus the COVID situation?
And that's a good question.
Yeah, to be honest, I would maybe yes, because I mean, if you think about it, like of the major issues and findings that we had, like very few of it was technical. It was like it was management and developing that kind of stuff. Like, yes, would there be a benefit if we could, you could lean more heavily on the cloud? Could you have done that? Yeah, but I think a lot of the underlying issues with the miscommunication and the late requirements and the emerging requirements, like late in the process, like those are all issues that probably would still happen today. That's my sense, Nate.
Yeah, I'd probably fall on that. Yeah, I'd probably err on that side too. That yeah, I'd just say yes. Because so many factors and there's so many different variables on what could have caused it and what could have helped save it, that that ultimately I do think yeah, I think it could absolutely happen again.
Okay, here's another one. How were the dates for major program events determined? Dart thrown at the calendar? or determination of achievable durations and sequences?
The major one I think was the act itself, the Affordable Care Act. The law itself had the requirement of fully active marketplaces beginning 1 January of 2014. And then I think they backed up the open enrollment period for that 1 October. So yeah, I think that was one where like that major milestone had not much wiggle room.
Yeah, and I also think that I don't think they didn't have a project plan, right? I mean, they showed clearly planned out dates for milestones within the major milestones. It was just they were just getting a bow wave effect of missed milestones and not addressing it. So and not updating the plan fast enough. But I think it appeared to me that they put thought in behind when they should have things done.
Okay, here's another question. How did they solve the leadership issues?
So initially they brought in somebody and just assigned them as the person in charge. And I think it wasn't just signing one person. I mean, that helped a lot, but also breaking down the clear lines of organizational channels. And coming from the military and seeing the way the government hierarchy works, who your organizational boss is really important. And so in a government setting, like clearly identifying who has the ball, is something that's super important. So I think that was the first thing it was clear that up and assign somebody like fully responsible. I don't know, Dean, you got anything to add there?
Yeah, no, there's Jeffrey Zients was the overall individual. But again, I think a lot of when you start removing that structure, which they did, and they removed a lot of that department and the organizational barriers, like it allows like another type of leadership to emerge, and that's like individual leaders, right? So absent title leadership of like this guy's in charge, what you really need is you need someone to step in. If that doesn't exist, then that's, especially as project managers, like that's why I said, like you're a titleless leader, right? You don't have any real authority to hire or fire anyone, but you can exercise those soft skills and exert your leadership and make the project successful. And so I think when you do that badgeless culture and you remove those barriers, it allows for that kind of leadership to step in addition to someone at the top who allows the organization to do that. That makes sense.
Okay, do we still have time for more questions? How are we doing on time?
We're good. We have till 8 o'clock. Maybe a couple more questions.
Okay, we got 2 more questions. One of them is similar to one that was asked before. It's related to Agile. So in your opinion, will there have been a different outcome if the project teams followed a waterfall approach versus an Agile approach, given the reduced familiarity with how Agile works?
So my feeling is no. And I say that because I still think the framework was less important than all of the contributing factors. Not waterfall done well, yeah, that would have been better than what they did, for sure. But Agile done well would have been better than what they did. And so, I think there was a lot of good reasons to pick Agile. They were building something new. The architecture was new. They've got, they knew they were going to have requirement issues with all the states and the political nature. But they just didn't do a lot of the right things, which is, get it out fast, test it, build smaller versions. They kind of went big right away. And so I think that the approach is less, less causal than the execution.
Thank you. So for the last question here, it seems reasonable that some websites and services will draw a lot of traffic for a given event. As an example, open enrollment. Outside of ensuring server capacity, will another technique like metering help the success rate or lack thereof on day one?
So would a tactic like mirroring?
Like metering.
Oh, metering.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I mean, so I'm not an engineer. I pretend to be a lot on my software teams, but I'm actually not. I would love to go into the technical strategies they could have used, they basically equated to having what they say, like 250,000 cars get on the freeway on one on-ramp. Right. And so, I think it's hard for me to even say this way out of my wheelhouse, but, I don't even know if metering would have helped that much. I think it would have helped, but it's, the scope, it didn't feel architected for the scope of what they were doing. And I think that was one of the biggest issues that we ran into. But
yeah, and kind of like what we talked about earlier in the Q&A, especially at the end there, they got so focused on just trying to put out a functioning product that they didn't sit down and consider like the risk. And so like there was no strategy on like, hey, what happens when everyone tries to get on this thing on the first day because it's been in the news or it's a major event, so there was no risk assessment, there was no risk mitigation or risk consideration, so like irrespective of what you would have done to mitigate that risk, like, they didn't even think about it. They were just trying to get something up that was functioning.
Yeah, so when they got into panic mode too, they cut a lot of stuff. And the stuff they cut wasn't like the scope or new features. They cut a lot of the performance testing. And, in theory, 30 days earlier of performance testing, they would have figured that out.
Okay, we got time for one more question.
Okay, sure.
Yes, did the reports indicate to what extent they took the time to architect for scale, choosing the right product mix? The SQL decision seems like really substandard decision, for instance.
Again, I'm not an engineer, so I'm not going to comment on the technology that they picked. I got the feel that they were well aware that the website was going to get a lot of traffic. Like that shouldn't have been a surprise. And so I think that the architecture they used could have supported it. Right. But I think a lot of the just bad practices and execution, the right solution done in a bad way, or maybe put it the other way, a subpar solution executed really well is better than the perfect solution not executed well, right? And so maybe that's kind of where they fall. Unless, Dean, you have.
No, and I think the kind of the disparate organizational structure of CMS and just kind of where everyone was in the picture, like it seemed to me it was lacking that overall architectural vision. And so I think that was the major. I don't know. It did. Yeah, none of the reports we saw didn't speak to how much time they dedicated to it, but just the other things, like you said, like the NoSQL decision. It seems like left hand's not talking to right hand, and so I don't think there was an overall plan per se.
But full disclaimer, I'm not an engineer. So, okay.
Okay, thank you for answering the questions, Nate and
Yeah.
Dean. We appreciate it.
The last thing I'll say is this is fun for Dean and I to crack this open, and really try to learn as much as we could about this project. And so, when we send out the slides, we'll also have the links to the reports. I encourage you to read them. I think it's super interesting. I enjoyed it a lot. And so this is fun for me, and Dean, looks like you're having fun.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, this is fun. And so yeah, we're happy to do this and thank the PMI for letting us.
The PDUs for tonight's event. Okay, so you get 1.25 PDUs for this, and PSPMI members who are registered for our meetings will have their PDUs entered automatically within 2 weeks, and non-members must enter manually. And so we're going to have our talent show on December 13th. This year's talent show for Christmas is PSPMI's Got Talent. It'll be a blended interactive events with live host, curated videos, and voting via Zoom webinar. So mark your calendars, and more details to come. And now we're off to our raffle.
So let's see who is our first winner. It's Devon Cunningham. Congratulations. Please send me or all the panelists your email address so we can send you the gift card. Let's see our second winner. It's gonna be FPS2. Please don't forget to send your email address.